The cold came for Sarah Bratvick on the 17th of January, 1890. It did not come fast. It came the way winter always comes to a poorly built cabin on the Wyoming plains, through the seams, through the floor, through the gaps where green cottonwood had shrunk away from itself, leaving lines of pale daylight where there should have been wood. Ansel knelt beside the bed. The stove was burning hot enough to scorch the iron. He had stuffed it past full an hour ago, and still, when he laid his palm against his wife's forehead, the heat he felt was not the warmth of fever. It was the last warmth of a body the cold had already claimed. Wren stood by the door, 9 years old, barefoot, holding his little sister against his chest. Linnea was 5. She did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere in the second night, and that frightened Ansel more than anything. Outside, the wind crossed the ridge from the north and rattled the loose shingles. The lamp on the table flickered every time a gust struck the wall. The flame leaned. It bent. It nearly went out. Sarah opened her eyes once. She looked at her husband. She looked past him at the children by the door. She tried to say something, and the breath that came out of her was a small white cloud that hung in the room for a long moment before it disappeared. Then she closed her eyes. The lamp flickered again. The wind found another seam. And Ansel Bratvick, 34 years old, sat beside the bed and listened to the cabin breathe around him like a wounded animal. He understood in that moment what had killed her. It was not the fever. The fever was only the door the cold had walked through. The thing that had killed Sarah was the house itself. 1 year later, in the summer of 1891, the people of Cottonwood Hollow began to slow their wagons whenever they passed the Bratvick place. Not because the cabin looked impressive, because it looked wrong. Every few days now, Ansel Bratvick came down the dry wash south of the basin, dragging a stone boat loaded with black basalt and pale chunks of volcanic tuff. He had 2 horses. Juniper, a sorrel mare with a white star on her forehead, and Cinder, a gelding the color of wet ash. They leaned into the harness together, and the stones cut deep scars through the prairie grass behind them. He worked alone. He worked from first light to last light, and sometimes by lantern after that. And beside him always was the dog. Ozark, a blue tick hound, 11 years old, gone gray around the muzzle, with one ear that hung lower than the other. He had been Sarah's dog first. He had slept at the foot of her bed for 9 winters. After she was gone, he had spent 2 weeks lying in the doorway, refusing to eat, lifting his head only when the children came near. Then one morning, he had walked out to where Ansel was sharpening a chisel on the porch, and he had laid down beside the man's boots, and he had not left his side since. Ozark watched the stones come up the hill. He watched Wren carry water to the horses. He watched Linnea sit in the shade of the half-built wall and arrange small, flat pebbles into shapes only she understood. And when riders came up the road from town, Ozark stood. He did not bark, he did not growl, he simply stood, and his hackles lifted, and he waited to see what the man on the horse would say. The first man on a horse was Thorsten Crawford. He was 50 years old. He owned the largest cattle outfit in the basin. He had survived 20 Wyoming winters, and he had buried 2 wives and a brother in those winters, and he had earned the right, he believed, to tell other men when they were being fools. He reined up beside the half-finished wall, and he looked at it for a long time without speaking. The stone shell already reached past Ansel's waist along the north side. It was rough, it was unlovely, and behind it, between the new stone and the old cottonwood logs of the cabin, there was a gap. A space? Wide enough in places to slide a hand through. Thorsten dismounted slowly. He walked to the wall. He pressed his glove against one of the cold black stones. "That thing," he said, "is going to hold winter like a cellar." Ansel did not look up. He was setting mortar into a seam, working it down with the edge of his trowel, and his hands were caked nearly to the wrists. "You wrap stone around wood," Thorsten said, "and the moisture gets between them. The wood rots, the stone sweats cold, the whole shell becomes a dead pocket." He paused. "You're not building a house, Bratvick, you're building a coffin. And you've got 2 small children inside it." Wren had stopped working. He was standing by the water bucket, holding the ladle, watching the man in the long oilskin coat. Linnea had not stopped. She was still arranging her pebbles. But Ansel saw her small hand pause, just for a moment, when the word coffin landed in the dry air. He set another stone into place. He pressed it down with the handle of his trowel. He did not raise his voice. "You will see," he said. That was all. Thorsten Crawford waited for more. Most men, when called fools in front of their children, found more words. But Ansel only kept working. Stone after stone, seam after seam. As if the older man on the horse were not standing 5 feet away from him, Thorsten mounted up again. He looked once at the children, his face, hard a moment before, softened into something heavier, something closer to grief. Then he rode back down the hill, and behind him, Ozark sat down in the dust and watched until the horse was a small, dark shape against the brown grass. To understand what Ansel Brattvik was building, you have to go back further than the cabin, further than Wyoming, further than Sarah. You have to go back to a coal patch in the mountains of western Pennsylvania in the year 1876 when a boy of 19 first met an old man named Halvar Quinn. Halvar was 63. He was half Cornish, half Norwegian, and entirely strange. He had come over on a boat as a boy and learned stonework in 3 countries before settling in the Pennsylvania anthracite fields, where he built the cold storage sheds and the powder magazines for the mining companies. He did not build the way other masons built. He left air inside his walls. The other men laughed at him for it. The supervisors at the mine sometimes argued, and every time the argument was over, Halvar's sheds were the ones still standing, and his potatoes were the ones that had not frozen, and his black powder was the one that had not gone damp. He took young Ansel as a hand because the boy was quiet, and Halvar had no patience for talkers. On a bitter night in February of that first winter, the old man brought Ansel into a small root cellar built into the side of a granite slope above the mining camp. The wind that night was screaming through the pass hard enough to tear loose snow off the slate roofs of the bunkhouses. The sound of it carried across the valley like sheet metal being pulled apart. Halvar shut the door behind them, and inside, almost nothing moved. The old man struck a sulfur match and lit a tallow candle, and he set the candle on a flat stone beside the inner wall. The flame stood up straight. It did not tremble, it did not lean, it did not flicker. Heat survives, Halvar said, where air dies. He let the boy stand in that silence for a long minute. He let him hear how the storm outside had become a distant thing. Then he showed him the thick outer wall, the narrow cavity behind it, the small vents hidden low at the footing and high beneath the roof beam. The drainage gravel under the floor. Wind hits the outer stone, he said. The cavity holds dead air. Dead air keeps the heat in. Stone holds what the sun gives in the day and lets it out slow at night. But the real protection is the stillness. He knelt then and scraped a fingernail of moisture from one of the lower vents. Trap wet inside these walls, he said, and winter turns the whole thing against you. The wall must breathe. Slow, like a sleeping man. Never sealed. Never sealed. Ansel was 19 years old. He did not understand all of it that first night, but he remembered the candle that did not flicker. For the next 4 years, he worked beside Halvar, and he wrote down what the old man taught him in a small leather notebook that Halvar had given him for that purpose. By the time Ansel left Pennsylvania, the notebook was full. He carried it with him to Iowa. He carried it through Nebraska. He carried it across the South Pass and down into the wide brown country that would become Wyoming territory. And he carried it the night he met Sarah Halloran outside a Methodist meeting in Rock Springs. And he carried it on the day he filed his homestead claim in the small valley that the old maps called Cottonwood Hollow. And then, in the spring of 1886, with his bride waiting in a boarding house in town and the snow not yet off the ridges, Ansel did the thing that would later kill her. He built the cabin fast. Too fast. He used green cottonwood because it was what grew along the creek and because it was free. He let a neighbor help him raise it in 2 weekends because the neighbor had a strong back and a willing crew, and Ansel was in a hurry to bring his wife home. He never opened the notebook. The notebook stayed in the bottom of his trunk for 5 years, until the night Sarah died. Now, in the summer of 1891, the notebook lay open on a flat rock beside the half-built wall. The pages were yellowed, the ink in places had run. But the diagrams were still clear, the measurements were still readable, and the careful, slanted handwriting of Halvar Quinn watched over Ansel Brattvik like the eye of a man not yet entirely dead. Ren came up the slope carrying 2 stones in his arms. He set them down where his father pointed. He did not speak. He was a quiet boy by nature, and quieter still since his mother's death. Linnea ran along behind Ozark, her small bare feet white with dust. She had been a chubby baby. She was a thin child now. The summer sun made the freckles come out across the bridge of her nose, but underneath the freckles, the skin was pale, and Ansel watched her more carefully than he watched the wall. Every time the wind shifted cold across the ridge, even in July, Linnea coughed. It was a small cough, a dry cough, the kind of cough that meant nothing in a healthy child. But Sarah's cough had started small, too. If you have ever had to make an impossible choice to protect your children, the kind of choice that costs you everything but the thing you cannot lose, then you already know what Ansel Bratvick felt that summer. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I'd like to know who's here with us. By the middle of August, the news of what Ansel was doing had traveled the length of the valley. The blacksmith in town was a man named Garrett Wexler. He was 38, broad as a barn door, with hands the color of old iron. He had built his own forge from local field stone, and he considered himself, with some justification, the most practical man in Sweetwater County. When Ansel came to him in July to order extra trowels and a heavy iron pry bar, Garrett had taken the order without comment. When Ansel came in August to order more, Garrett laid down his hammer and crossed his arms. How much rock you fixing to put on that hill, Bratvick? Enough. You know, stone don't hold heat the way wood does. I know, Garrett shook his head. I'm not making your tools anymore. Not for that. Ansel looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned, and he walked out of the forge, and he did not come back. The story went around town that afternoon. By evening, Cornelius Strand had heard it. Cornelius was 55 years old. He owned 3,000 acres on the south end of the basin, and he wanted 6,000. He had been watching the Bratvick homestead for 2 years because it sat astride the only year-round spring on the western slope, and a spring like that was worth more than the land that surrounded it. He came up the road 3 days later in a polished black buggy with a clean white shirt and a clean white collar, and he reined his fine bay horse in beside the half-built wall. He did not get out of the buggy. "Mr. Bratvick," he said, "I hear you're in some difficulty." Ansel kept working. "The valley is talking," Cornelius said, "and the things they're saying are not kind. Your wife is gone. Your children are small. You are alone on this hill, and the work you are doing, forgive me, does not appear to be wise." He let that sit. "I would be willing," he said, "to take this place off your hands. A fair price, cash, you could go east, start fresh, your children deserve a proper roof and a proper town. Not whatever this is going to be." Ansel said a stone. He pressed it down. He looked finally at the man in the buggy. "My spring is not for sale," he said. Cornelius Strand smiled. It was a small smile, a patient smile. The smile of a man who had bought 12 homesteads in 8 years and had never once paid the asking price. "We shall see," he said. "Winters in this country have a way of changing a man's mind." He turned the buggy. He drove back down the hill. And Ozark, who had been lying in the shade beside the cabin door, stood up and watched him go. And the hair along the dog's spine lifted slowly and did not lie down again until the buggy was out of sight. The sermon came on the 3rd Sunday of September. The Reverend Obadiah Pike was 45 years old. He had served the Methodist Episcopal Church in Cottonwood Hollow for 9 years. He was a thin man, with a thin voice, and a way of looking at his congregation that made each of them feel he was speaking directly to them about a sin only they had committed. That Sunday, he preached on the Tower of Babel. He preached about men who trusted in stone instead of in God, men who believed their own cleverness could keep out the punishments of nature, which were the punishments of the Almighty, men who, in their pride, surrounded themselves with walls and called those walls salvation. He did not name Ansel Bratvick. He did not need to. Every head in the small frame church knew exactly who the preacher meant. After the service, the women lingered on the steps. Prudence Mallory was at the center of them. She was 60 years old, the widow of the town's first postmaster, and she had not held a piece of information for more than 2 hours in 40 years of practice. "The man has lost his mind," she said. "I have said it from the beginning. Grief does this. It empties the head, and those poor children, that little girl, is not well. Anyone with eyes can see it. She needs a woman in that house. She needs a doctor. She does not need a father building walls." The other women nodded. Word traveled. By Tuesday, the dry goods store would not extend Ansel credit for lime. By Wednesday, the livery would not rent him a second draft horse to help with the heaviest stones. By Friday, a boy of 22 named Rhett Tanner, a saddle shop apprentice with a loud voice and a fondness for tavern wagers, had laid down $5 silver on the bar at the Cottonwood Hotel and announced that Bratvick's wall would crack before Christmas. 3 other men matched the bet within the hour, but not everyone in Cottonwood Hollow laughed. Marta Olson was 60 years old. She had come over from a fishing village north of Bergen when she was 22, and she had served as midwife and herb woman for the basin for 35 of the 38 years since. She also carried the mail on the spur route from the rail stop because the man who was supposed to carry it drank, and Marta did not. On the last Friday of September, she rode up the hill on her stout pony with the leather mail satchel slung across her back, and she did not hand Ansel his letters right away. She stood beside the wall for a long time. She walked around it slowly. She put her hand into the cavity gap, and then she stepped back, and she looked at Ansel the way a person looks at a familiar face she had not expected to see. "Stabber," she said quietly. Ansel paused his trowel. "My father built one," she said, "in Vassestrand, above the fjord, to keep the grain dry through the winter, 2 walls, the air between, vents low and high." She smiled, but the smile was wet at the edges. "I have not seen a stabber since I was a young woman." She handed him his mail. "You are not building for warmth," she said. "Anyone who tells you that is a fool. You are building for stillness." It was the first time in 3 months of labor and ridicule that anyone in Cottonwood Hollow had said the right word for what he was doing. Ansel set down his trowel. He looked at the old Norwegian woman, and for the first time since the night Sarah died, his eyes filled. He did not let it pass his lashes. He turned his face. He picked up the trowel again. But Marta saw, and Marta did not speak of it, and Marta climbed back onto her stout pony and rode down the hill, and the next morning she came back with a basket of dried angelica and chamomile and yarrow for Linnea's chest, and after that, she came once a week, and she did not stop. By the first week of October, the wall stood complete. Along the north and west sides, it was rough, it was unlovely, it was the color of black coffee and ash. And inside the narrow cavity, where Ansel had set the lower vents and the angled drainage skirt, a man could hear the wind move through and then die against the dead air, and the cabin behind it had stopped shivering for the first time in 5 years. Then came the first hard frost. It came on a Thursday night. Ansel woke at 4 a.m. because Ozark was standing at the foot of his bed, very still, with his ears forward. The boy and the girl were asleep in the trundle beside the stove. He covered them, he took the lantern, he went outside. The sky was clear. The stars were so cold and bright, they looked like ice nailed to a black ceiling. And along the lower seam of the north wall, where the cavity met the gravel trench, a thin ribbon of frost had formed. He knelt. He put his bare hand against the stone. The stone bit back at him. Moisture had gathered inside the cavity overnight, and the lower vent had not cleared it fast enough. And now the cold was coming through the damp seam, the way cold always comes through, damp stone directly, hungrily like a man finding an unlocked door. Halverquin's voice came back to him out of the Pennsylvania dark. "Trap wet inside these walls, and winter turns the whole thing against you." Ansel sat back on his heels. He looked at the frost. He looked at the wall he had built with his own 2 hands across 4 months of summer heat and ridicule and exhaustion and grief. Then he stood up, and he went to the tool shed, and he took down the heavy iron pry bar, and he began to break it open. By the time the sun came up, 3 feet of finished wall lay in chunks of half-frozen mortar at the bottom of the gravel trench, and pale steam rose off the exposed seam, and Thorsten Crawford rode by on his way to check his cattle and reined up at the sight. He did not gloat. He did not say, "I told you so." He sat on his horse and watched Ansel Brattvik tear apart his own work with the rising sun on his shoulders, and something in the older man's face shifted briefly into something that was not contempt. Then he rode on. That afternoon, Ansel mixed a heavier batch of lime mortar. He widened the lower vent by 2 inches. He rebuilt the section from the footing upward. By dark, it was done. He stood looking at the repaired seam for a long time without moving. Behind him, in the cabin, he could hear Linnea coughing again, quieter than the cough that had killed her mother, but the same shape, the same start. 2 days later, Cornelius Strand drove his polished black buggy up the hill a second time. "Mr. Brattvik," he said, "I have heard your wall failed." "It did not fail," Ansel said. "I corrected it." "A wall that needs correction in October," Cornelius said gently, "is a wall that will fail in January. My offer stands. In fact, given the circumstances, I am prepared to increase it." He named a figure. It was a low figure. It was an insulting figure for a homestead with a year-round spring, but it was, Ansel knew, more money than he had ever held in his hand. He thought of Linnea coughing in the cold. He thought of Wren's small face in the lantern light, watching everything, saying nothing. He thought of Sarah's last breath hanging in the room. "My spring," he said, "is not for sale." Cornelius Strand sat very still in his buggy. Then he smiled, the same patient smile. "As you wish." He turned the buggy, And as he drove down the hill that second time, Ozark stood at the corner of the wall, and the hair along his spine lifted, and the old dog growled low and long for the first time since the night Sarah died. Ansel marked that he did not yet know why. But he marked it. Pause for a moment with me. Think about the people in your own life, the ones who told you that what you were doing was foolish, the ones who said it kindly because they were certain they knew better, and the ones who said it cruelly because they wanted you to fail. Have you ever been able to tell the difference between them? Sometimes you cannot. Sometimes you only find out which was which when the storm comes. Tell me your story if you have one. I am listening. The third week of October brought the news that broke Ansel open. Marta brought it with the mail. She climbed off her pony slowly that day. She did not walk around the wall. She held a letter out to him with both hands, and when he took it, he saw that the postmark was Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and his throat closed before he had even unfolded the page. He read it standing in the cold autumn light. It was from a man named Eamon Quinn. The signature said he was Halvar's brother's son, Halvar's nephew, raised in the same Pennsylvania coal patch, the closest kin the old Mason had after his own son had gone west to the Oregon country in '84 and was never heard from again. The letter was 8 months old. It had been forwarded twice. It said that Halvar Quinn, Master Mason, had been found dead in February in the unfinished stone cellar he had been building behind his own small house in the coal patch. He had been 68 years old. He had been working alone. He had finished the outer wall and started the inner wall, and the inner wall had been only waist high when the cold caught him. He had died, the letter said, of exposure. He had died inside his own unfinished work. Ansel folded the letter. He put it inside the leather notebook. He looked at Marta, and Marta did not speak. She had read the address on the envelope before she handed it over. She had guessed at the contents. He never finished it, Ansel said. His voice was very flat. He spent 40 years teaching other men how to build walls that would not kill them, and he died inside his own. Marta took his hand. She held it for one breath. Then she let it go, and she got back on her pony, and she rode down the hill, and Ansel walked into the cabin and sat on the edge of the bed where Sarah had died, and Wren came and stood beside him without speaking, and Linnea climbed into his lap and pressed her face into his shirt and coughed her small, dry cough. Ozark put his head on Ansel's boot. Outside, the wind from the north came across the ridge and tested the wall. The wall held. For the first time in 5 years, the wall held. And Ansel Brattvik understood that he was not building this thing only for his children and not only against the memory of his wife. He was finishing what his teacher had not lived to finish. He was carrying a debt across 2,000 miles in 15 years, and he would carry it until the work was done, or until the work killed him too. He bent his head over his daughter's hair. He closed his eyes. And outside, on the ridge, the first thin flakes of the season began to fall slow at first, then faster, gathering in the gravel trench and along the cold black seams of the wall that a quiet man, alone against the laughter of an entire valley, had nearly finished building in time. The first snow did not stay. By Saturday morning, it had melted into the gravel, leaving the black stones darker than before, and Ansel was back at the wall with a fresh batch of mortar and the iron trowel and the long silence that had settled over him since the letter came. He worked harder after that. He worked the way a man works when he understands, finally, that there is no second chance. He rose at 4, he laid stones until the light failed, he ate standing up, he slept 4 hours and rose again. Wren took over the small things without being asked. The boy was 9 years old, he had been carrying water and feeding Ozark and brushing down juniper and cinders since the spring. But now he began to do more. He began to bring his father coffee in a tin cup at first light. He began to set the table for supper, even when supper was only beans and biscuit. He began to sit with Linnea by the stove in the evenings and tell her the small, careful stories he made up out of nothing about a mouse who lived in the woodpile, about a rabbit who could not find his hat, and Linnea would listen, leaning against her brother's shoulder, and her small, dry cough would soften a little in the warmth. Ansel watched them across the room some nights. He did not speak of what he saw. But once, very late, after both children were asleep, he stood beside the trundle bed with the lantern in his hand, and he looked down at his son's face. The boy slept the way Sarah used to sleep, one hand tucked beneath his cheek, the other open against the blanket, and Ansel thought, he is becoming the man of this house before he has had time to be a child in it. He bent down. He kissed the boy's forehead. Wren did not wake. Ansel walked back out into the dark and finished mortaring the upper course of the west wall by lantern light, because if he stopped working, he would have to feel everything at once, and he was not yet ready. The first week of November came in, still and bright. It was the kind of week that fools men in Wyoming territory. The mornings were cold, but the afternoons were warm enough to work in shirt sleeves. The cottonwoods along the creek still held a few yellow leaves. The geese were going south in long, ragged lines, and the antelope had moved down off the high benches into the protected draws. Old Ezra Voss noticed. Ezra was 70 years old. He lived alone in a half dugout on the east rim of the basin with 3 chickens and a one-eyed mule, and he was, in the opinion of most of Cottonwood Hollow, half cracked. He spoke to the weather as if the weather could hear him. He kept a journal of the sky in a ledger book that no one had ever read. He had buried 2 sons in the influenza year and a wife in the diphtheria year, and after that, he had simply stopped coming to town except to trade for flour and tobacco. But Ezra Voss had survived 43 winters in this basin. And on the 2nd of November, he came up the long road from the east rim, leading his mule, with his old single-shot rifle slung across his back, and he did not stop until he was standing at the corner of Ansel's wall. He looked at the wall, he looked at the sky, he looked at Ansel. You done? 3 more days. 3 more days might be 3 too many. Ansel set down his trowel. What do you see? Ezra spit into the gravel. The geese gone early. The grass under the bunch grass is turning the wrong color. There's a ring around the sun yesterday that I've seen one other time in my life. That was 1857. The storm that come after that one killed 112 souls between here and the Powder River. He looked at the wall again. Whatever you're building, son, finish it. Don't sleep. Finish it. Then he turned and led his mule back down the hill, and Ansel watched him go, and behind him Ozark sat down in the gravel and did not take his eyes off the northern sky. He did not sleep that night or the next or the next. He worked by lantern. He worked through one rain that turned to sleet and back to rain. He worked while Marta Olson came up the hill with her satchel and stayed for 2 hours and cared for Linnea and then quietly, without being asked, mixed a fresh batch of mortar and handed it to him. Klaus Reinhold came on the second night. Klaus was 40 years old, a German immigrant, a farrier and rough carpenter who had been quietly watching Ansel's wall for 3 months from the doorway of the livery where he sometimes worked. He had said nothing the whole summer. He had refused to take part in the bets at the Cottonwood Hotel. He had not joined the women on the steps after church. On the 2nd of November, he simply appeared at Ansel's wall with a leather apron and his own trowel, and he said, in his thick, careful English, "I have built so, in the old country. My father also, show me where I help." Ansel looked at him for a long moment. He looked at his own raw hands. He looked at the unfinished 30 feet of east-facing wall. "There," he said. And his voice cracked just for a syllable, and he turned his face into the lantern light so the other man would not see. They worked together until the small hours. They worked the next day, and on the evening of the 5th of November, by the orange light of a lowering sun, Ansel Bratvik set the last stone into the last seam of the upper east course, and Klaus Reinhold struck the side of the stone gently with the back of his trowel, and the wall was finished. It was not beautiful. The corners were rough, the upper line was not perfectly true, the mortar in some places had run in pale streaks where the lime had been too wet. It looked from a distance like the broken back of some sleeping black animal lying against the cabin, but it was finished. The 2 men stood looking at it. Neither one spoke for a long time. Then Klaus Reinhold put a hand on Ansel's shoulder. "Now," he said, "we wait. Pause with me a moment. I want you to think of a time in your own life when you finished something hard and there was no one there to celebrate it with you. No band, no applause. Only the silence and the work and the knowing in your own bones. That is a particular kind of moment. It does not feel like victory. It feels like exhaustion. And then sometimes much later you realize it was the most important thing you ever did. If you have lived through a moment like that, I would like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments." It came on the 11th of November. It came faster than anyone in Cottonwood Hollow expected. By Tuesday morning, the air had thickened. The clouds were low and flat and the color of cold iron. The birds had gone. The cattle in Thorsten Crawford's lower pasture had drifted on their own into the lee of the willow brake along the creek and would not be moved. Ozark refused to leave the porch. He stood in the doorway, ears forward, nose lifted, scenting the wind. By noon, the first hard flakes were coming down. By 3 in the afternoon, the wind from the north was so strong that a man could not walk against it for more than 30 feet without turning his face away. By dusk, the basin was gone. Ansel had brought the water barrels inside. He had wrapped wet cloth around the door seams. He had banked the wood pile under heavy canvas against the south side of the cabin, where the new stone skirt blocked the worst of the drift. He had brought Juniper and Cinder into the small lean-to barn behind the cabin and stuffed clean straw thick around them, and he had set a tin lamp on a shelf where the horses could see its small, steady glow. Then he had come inside. He had barred the door. He had stood for one moment in the middle of the room with the lantern in his hand, looking at his sleeping children and his old dog and the iron stove and the leather notebook on the shelf above the table, and he had felt, for the first time in 5 years, the cabin behind him not shivering. The wind hit the north wall. The wind hit stone. The cabin behind the stone did not shake. Ansel set the lantern down on the table. He sat in the chair beside the stove. And for the first time in many nights, he closed his eyes. The first night passed. The second night passed. By the morning of the third day, the storm had not weakened. The thermometer Ansel kept nailed to the north post of the porch had read 40 below zero before dawn, and the wind chill was a thing no instrument in Cottonwood Hollow could measure. Snow had drifted halfway up the north wall. The lower vents were holding, just because Ansel had gone out twice in the night with the iron pry bar to clear them. And each time he had come back inside with his coat white and his beard frozen and Ozark licking his hands as if to count the fingers and make sure they were all still there. But inside the cabin, the air was still. The lamp on the table burned with a flame that did not lean. The tin cup that had rattled all last winter against the nail beside the stove hung motionless. The floor did not bleed cold. Linnea slept on the bed nearest the stove, wrapped in 2 wool blankets. Her cough had eased in the dry, steady warmth. Wren had been carving small shapes out of pine scraps with his pocket knife, and he had given up at some point in the middle of the morning and curled against Ozark on the rag rug, and the boy and the dog now slept together as if they had been doing it for 100 years. Ansel sat at the table with Halvar's notebook open. He was reading it for no particular reason. He had read every page 100 times. But there was a comfort now in seeing the careful, slanted handwriting of his teacher, here in the room while the storm beat itself to death against the wall outside. It felt almost as if Halvar were sitting at the other end of the table. Then Linnea coughed. It was a different cough. He looked up. She had not opened her eyes. She had not moved. But the cough was wet now. It was deep. It came from low in her chest, and it ended in a small, thin wheeze. Ansel set the notebook down very slowly. He crossed the room. He knelt beside the bed and put his hand against his daughter's forehead. The heat under his palm was not the warmth of a sleeping child. It was the heat that had killed her mother. He sat back on his heels. The storm hit the north wall. The wall held, and Ansel Bratvick, who had spent 4 months building a thing that the whole valley said would kill his children, knelt beside his daughter's bed and understood that the thing he had built might not be enough. He woke Wren. He did it gently. He sat on the edge of the trundle and put a hand on the boy's shoulder and said his name twice, low, the way Sarah used to wake him. Wren. The boy's eyes opened. Your sister has the fever. Marta has the medicine, the bark and the angelica root, and the chest plaster. I cannot leave Linnea. Do you understand me? The boy understood. The boy had understood since the moment the cough changed. I will go, Wren said. No. No, son, listen to me. I need you to stay here. I need you to keep the stove. I need you to put the wet cloth on her forehead. I am going to ride to Marta's myself as soon as the wind drops, as soon as I can see 30 feet. Listen to me. Do you understand? Yes, Papa. Promise. I promise. The boy's eyes did not leave his father's eyes. Ansel kissed his forehead. He went to the stove. He put another log in. He put the kettle on. He tore a clean cloth into strips and wet them in the basin and laid one across Linnea's forehead. He held his daughter's small hand for a long moment in his big, rough hand. He looked at the lamp and he prayed without words, the way men pray who have not been to church in a long time and have nothing left to bargain with. Then he stood up. He looked through the small window that faced north. The world outside was white. It was moving. It was a wall of moving white. He could not see the lean-to barn 40 feet from the door. He could not see the corner of his own stone wall. He could not ride. If he tried to ride, he would die on the way, and Linnea would die in her bed, and Wren would be alone in a cabin with 2 bodies, and the thought of it sat down inside Ansel's chest like a stone he could not lift. He sat by the bed. He waited. Outside, the wind shifted half a point west and rose. He did not know when he slept. He had not meant to sleep. He had only laid his head down on the edge of the bed beside his daughter's hand, just for a moment to rest his eyes. He woke because Ozark was barking. The old dog had not barked all winter. He had not barked in months. But now he was standing at the cabin door, hackles up the full length of his spine, and he was barking the deep two-note bark that meant trouble. Ansel sat up. The cabin was dim. The trundle bed was empty. He stood, he turned in a slow circle. He looked at the chair where Wren had been. The boy's wool coat was gone. The boy's boots were gone. The leather mittens Marta had knitted him in October were gone. Ansel ran to the door. He shoved Ozark back. He shoved the bar up. He pulled the door open, and the wind tore it out of his hand and slammed it against the inside wall of the cabin, and white powder roared into the room in a wave. He fought his way out. He fought his way around to the lean-to barn. Juniper was gone. The mare's stall stood open. The straw was scattered. Cinder, the gelding, was standing at the back of his stall with his head down and his ears pinned, the way a horse stands when his stablemate has been taken from him. Ansel turned in the wind. He cupped his hands. Vren, the wind took the word. Vren, the wind took it again. There was no echo. There was no answer. There was no shape in the moving white. There was no track on the ground because the ground itself was moving the snow, scouring across the gravel, rebuilding the drifts faster than a boy on a horse could open them. Ansel fell to his knees in the drift. He put his hands flat against the snow. He understood in that moment every choice he had made wrong in his life. He had built the cabin too fast. He had not opened the notebook in time. He had let Sarah die in a house he had built with his own hands. And now his son, his quiet, careful 9-year-old son who had promised, had taken the mare into a storm that had killed grown men, and Ansel could not follow him, because if he followed him, the child in the cabin would die alone. He stayed on his knees. The wind beat at him. Ozark stood at the open cabin door and barked into the white. Anselrose. He turned. He fought his way back inside, and he barred the door, and he sat on the floor with his back against the door and his head in his hands, and for the first time since the night Sarah died, Ansel Brattvik wept. He wept the way a man weeps who has run out of choices. He wept while the storm shook the wall and could not get in. He wept until Linnea coughed in her sleep. Then he stood up. He wiped his face on his sleeve. He went back to his daughter. Stay with me. I know this is hard. If you have ever been forced to choose between two people you love to stay with one and let the other go into the dark, knowing that whatever happens next will not be undone, then I do not have to explain to you what was inside Ansel Brattvik that night. There are no good words for it. There is only the choosing and the living afterward. Tell me, have you ever made a choice like that? Are you carrying one tonight? I am here. The fourth day broke without breaking. There was no sunrise that anyone in the basin would later remember. The wind had not stopped, but it had shifted lower along the ground, and the snow was no longer coming sideways, but settling, heavy and dry, in long curling drifts that climbed halfway up the stone wall on the north side of the Brattvik cabin. Inside, Linnea's fever had not broken. She had not opened her eyes since the previous afternoon. Her breath was small and quick. Her lips were the color of the gray sky outside the window. Ansel had been changing the cloth on her forehead every 20 minutes through the night. He had been counting her breaths. He had been holding her small hand in his big, rough hand for so many hours that he had stopped feeling his own fingers. He had not slept. He could not sleep. He could only sit and listen and count and wait for a thing he could not name. At a few minutes past 9 o'clock that morning, Ozark lifted his head from the rug. The old dog stood up slowly. He walked to the door. He pressed his nose against the seam of the door, and his tail, which had not moved in 2 days, began to move. Anselrose. He listened. He heard very faintly beyond the wind the sound of a horse blowing hard. He crossed to the door. He lifted the bar. He pushed the door open against the drift, and the snow came in. And beyond the snow, fighting up the last 100 feet of the road with steam rising off her dark, wet coat, came a horse. Juniper, the sorrel mare with the white star. And on her back, leaning low against her neck with his arms wrapped in the mane and his small face white with frost, was Wren. Behind him, holding the boy in the saddle with one arm riding the same horse, was Marta Olsen. The old Norwegian woman lifted her head. She saw Ansel in the doorway. She did not smile. She only nodded once, and she kept the mare moving forward, one slow, heaving step after another, until she was close enough for Ansel to reach up and lift his son down out of her arms. The boy was alive. That was the first miracle. His face was frostbitten along the right cheek and the tip of the nose, and 3 fingers of his left hand had gone, the color that fingers go when a man may yet lose them, and his small body was shaking the way a body shakes when it has been past cold for too long and does not yet know how to stop. But he was alive. He was conscious. He was looking at his father with the same steady gray eyes he had looked with on the night they buried his mother. "I made it, Papa." That was all he said. Then he closed his eyes and let himself be carried inside. Ansel laid the boy on the rug by the stove. He stripped the frozen wool from his arms. He wrapped him in 2 dry blankets. He rubbed the boy's hands between his own, slow, careful, the way Martha had taught him long ago, and Martha knelt across from him and did the same for the boy's small white feet. She did not speak yet. She worked. She made him drink warm broth from a tin cup, sip by sip. She rubbed his cheeks gently with the back of a warm spoon. She watched his color come back. She watched the shaking begin in earnest, which she had told him long ago was a good sign because a body that is past help does not shake. Only when the boy was breathing easy, lying with his face against Ozark's flank, did Marta turn to the bed where Linnea lay. She put her hand on the child's forehead. She put her ear against the child's chest. She closed her eyes for a long moment, listening. Then she opened her satchel. She took out the small dark bottles, the dried angelica root, the yarrow tincture, the flannel for the chest plaster, the willow bark. She worked without speaking. Ansel knelt beside her and did what she told him to do, held the cup, lifted the child's small head, supported the small back while Marta listened to the chest a second time, and the storm beat against the north wall, and the lamp burned with a steady flame, and the cabin held its warmth around them like a closed hand. After a long time, Marta sat back. She wiped her forehead with her sleeve. "She will live," she said. She said it in Norwegian first. Then she remembered and said it again in English. "She will live, Ansel. She is sick, but she is not as sick as her mother was. And this house is not the house that took Sarah. This house is dry. This house is warm. This house is still, she has a chance here. She has a real chance." Ansel did not answer. He could not. He put his hand over his face, and his shoulders moved, and Marta laid her old wrinkled hand on the back of his neck the way a mother lays her hand on the back of her grown son's neck, and she did not say anything more for a long while. When Ansel could speak again, he said, very low, "How did he find you?" Marta almost laughed. It came out more like a breath. "He found me, Ansel. Just barely. He rode her right to my gate. He was past speaking when he came off her saddle. He fell into the drift outside my door, and the mare stood over him, and she would not move until I came out with the lantern. If she had stopped 50 yards short of the gate, I would not have known he was there. I would have gone back to bed. He chose well, Ansel. Sarah's mare chose well. They both chose well." Ansel turned to look at the door, as if he could see through it to the lean-to barn, where Juniper now stood exhausted, blanketed, given hot mash by Marta's own hands before she had come inside. He thought, Sarah's mare. Because Juniper had been Sarah's. Sarah had picked her out as a yearling. Sarah had named her. He bent his head. He did not say it aloud. But he thought, thank you, both of you. The wind shifted in the middle of the afternoon. It did not stop. It only changed. It came off the wall now in long, shuddering gusts, and the snow began to fall straight down instead of sideways, and a man inside the cabin could hear, between the gusts, a small, thin silence that had not been there for 3 days. It was during one of those small silences that Ozark stood up. The old dog walked to the door. He did not bark this time. He whined. Ansel went to the door. He lifted the bar. He pushed it open just enough to look out. There was a figure in the road. A man walking, falling, rising, walking again, wading through drifts that came nearly to his hips, with no horse, no coat hood, his beard white with ice, and his face, even at 100 yards, the gray color of a face that has stopped feeling itself. In his arms, he was carrying something, a small bundle wrapped in a wool blanket that was nearly the same color as the snow. Ansel ran out into the drift without his coat. He met the man 20 yards from the cabin. It was Thorsten Crawford. The rancher's lips had cracked open. His eyes were almost swollen shut. The hand he reached out to grip Ansel's sleeve had no glove on it, and the fingers were the color of wax. In his other arm, he held a small girl. She was perhaps 6 years old. She was not moving. "My grandchildren," Thorsten said. He said it through teeth that would not stop chattering. "My boy's wife, the roof came down. Bratvik, please, please." Ansel did not speak. He lifted the small girl out of the old man's arms. He half carried, half dragged Thorsten the last 20 yards to the cabin door. And as they crossed the threshold into the still, dry, warm air of the stone-walled house, the man who had once called Ansel a fool, the man who had told an entire valley that Ansel Bratvik was building a coffin for his children, sat down on the floor just inside the door, and he put his frostbitten hands over his face, and he made a sound that Ansel had never heard a grown man make before. It was not weeping. It was something older than weeping. It was the sound of a man who had finally understood too late what he had done. The little girl in the wool blanket was named Hetty. She was 6 years old, and she was the older of Thorsten Crawford's 2 grandchildren, and she had not opened her eyes in the 4 hours since her grandfather had pulled her out of what had been left of their cabin. Ansel laid her on the rug beside the stove. Marta was already moving. She had pulled the blanket open. She had her ear against the child's chest. She had her old gnarled fingers against the side of the small white throat, feeling for the pulse the way she had felt for 1,000 pulses across 38 years of bringing children into the world, and sometimes of letting them go out of it. "She is here," Marta said. "She is still here. Get me the warm water. Get me dry wool. Get me the bottle and the green stopper. Move, Ansel." Ansel moved. Ren, lying against Ozark, sat up at the sound of his father's name. The boy did not say anything. He simply stood on legs that still shook a little, and he went to the wood box and began stacking small splits beside the stove without being told. Thorsten Crawford sat on the floor by the door. He had not stood up since they had brought him through it. He sat with his back against the cold wood of the inner cabin wall, and his frostbitten hands turned upward in his lap, and his eyes stayed on the small body of his granddaughter, and he did not blink. "There is another one," he said, after a long time. His voice was a thing scraped out of him. "My boy's wife. And the little one, the baby. They are still up there. The barn is standing. They got into the barn before the roof came. I told them I would come back. I told them." He stopped. His mouth moved without sound. Marta did not look up from the child. "How far?" she said. 2 miles. A little more. The lower road. In this. Marta did not answer her own question. She did not have to. Ansel was already at the wall, taking down his heavy oilskin coat. He was already pulling on the second pair of wool stockings, the ones Sarah had knitted for him the winter before she died, the ones he had not worn in 2 years because he had not been able to bear the feel of them on his feet. He pulled them on now. He laced his boots. He took down the long scarf and the leather mittens and the iron pry bar. Ren stood up. "Papa?" Ansel did not turn around. "Papa, please. I have to go, son." I know you do. The boy's voice cracked, and he steadied it. He was 9 years old. He steadied his voice the way men twice his age could not take Cinder. "Juniper is finished. Cinder is rested. He is bigger. He will get you up the lower road." Ansel turned. He looked at his son. He looked at this 9-year-old boy who had ridden a horse alone through a blizzard the night before, and who was now telling him calmly and correctly which animal to take into the storm. He crossed the room. He put his hand on the back of the boy's neck. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. He simply held the boy's neck for one long breath, the way Halvor Quinn had once held his neck in a Pennsylvania root cellar 15 years before, and then he let him go. He went to the bed where Linnea lay. He bent down, he kissed her forehead. Her skin was cooler than it had been an hour ago. The cloth on her brow was barely warm. She was sleeping a real sleep now, not the thin gray sleep of fever. And Ansel pressed his lips to her hair, and he stood up and he turned to Marta. "If I do not come back, you will come back. If I do not, Ansel Bratvik, you will come back. You will come back because that boy on the floor is not going to lose another parent in this house. Go. Take the rope, take the lantern, go." He took Cinder. The gelding came out of the lean-to barn with his ears pinned and his nostrils wide, and he stood for a moment in the wind, and he did not refuse. Ansel tied the rope from the saddle to a heavy iron ring on the cabin door so that he would have a line back if the way out filled in behind him. He tied the lantern to the saddle horn, though he did not light it yet. He swung up onto the gelding's broad back. He turned the horse south. He let Cinder choose the footing. That was the only way to travel in such country, in such weather. A man could not see the road, a man could not see the ground. But a horse who had walked this country every day of his 5 years of life, a horse remembered. Cinder remembered. He took the lower road, he took it slowly, picking his way along the wind-scoured edges where the drifts were thinnest, leaning his great dark shoulder into the wind, the rope paid out behind them. Ansel counted in his head 300 feet, 400, 600, and at 1,000 feet, he untied his end and let it fall into the drift because he had nothing longer. And from here, he would have to find his way back by Cinder's memory alone. The Crawford place was 1.5 miles down the lower road and then up a short rise. He did not see the cabin. He saw, instead, where the cabin had been. A long, low pile of broken roof timbers, a piece of stovepipe standing up out of the snow, a single bent window frame leaning against what was left of the chimney. The whole north half had come down the heavy snow load on a roof not built to carry it, the sod bank giving way under 3 days of wind, the green logs splitting where the cold had found their hearts. Behind the wreckage stood the barn. The barn was still up. It was old, it was crooked, it was not insulated, but it was up. Ansel slid down off Cinder. He fought through the drift to the barn door. He hammered on it. "It is Bratvik," a long silence. Then a small, thin sound from inside. He pried the door open against the drift. In the gloom of the barn, behind a pile of feed sacks and a dead milk cow whose body had been used as a windbreak, a young woman was sitting up in the straw. She was perhaps 25 years old. Her hair had come down out of its pins. Her lips were cracked. Her left eye was swollen. Wrapped tight inside her coat against her chest, with only the small dark head showing, was a baby. The baby was making the small, thin sound. The young woman looked up at Ansel. For one moment, she did not seem to recognize him as human. She seemed to be looking through him at a place beyond him. Then her eyes focused, and they filled, and she did not speak. She held out the baby. Ansel took the baby first. He tucked it inside his own coat, against his own chest, the way Thorsten had carried Hetty. He felt the small body's faint warmth through his shirt. He felt the slight movement of breath. Then he reached down with both hands and lifted the young woman to her feet. She could barely stand. He half carried her out of the barn. He got her up onto Cinder's back. He swung up behind her with the baby still inside his coat. He turned the gelding's head north. "Take us home," he said. The horse took them home. He did not need a rope. He did not need a road. Cinder put one hoof in front of the other through drifts that came halfway up his chest, and he found, somehow, the line of his own outgoing tracks, already nearly filled in behind them, but still there for a horse to read. It took them 1 hour and 40 minutes to cover the 1.5 miles back. When they finally came up the last rise and Ansel saw the lantern of his own cabin glowing dim and steady through the moving white, he made a sound in his throat that was not a word. The young woman, half frozen in front of him, leaned her head back against his shoulder. She did not weep. She had no tears left. She only laid her head back, and she trusted him to carry her the last 100 feet. And that, Ansel thought, was a thing he had not known he could be trusted for, ever again. By dark of that 4th day, there were 9 people inside the Bratvik cabin. By midnight, there were 12. By the morning of the 5th day, there were 17. They came 1 and 2 at a time, through the long shuddering gusts and the steady falling snow. Klaus Reinhold came first, with his wife and his 8-year-old daughter their dugout had held, but they were nearly out of fuel, and they had heard from a passing rider that Bratvik's cabin was taking people in. Old Ezra Voss came on foot, leading his one-eyed mule, with his 3 chickens in a crate strapped to his back. The Tanner family came Rhett Tanner, the young man who had laid down $5 silver at the Cottonwood Hotel that the wall would crack by Christmas, came up the road carrying his sick mother on a sledge he had built that morning out of 2 broken floorboards and a length of rope. Rhett would not meet Ansel's eyes in the doorway. He stood there with his cap in his hand and his face the color of cold meat, and he said only, "My mother." Ansel held the door open. "Bring her in." The cabin grew warm. Not stifling, not stove-hot, but warm in the way that only a properly built winter house can be warm even. Dry, still, the walls did not bleed cold, the lamp on the table never trembled. The tin cup on its nail did not move. The 17 souls inside the cabin breathed and slept and ate and the warmth from their own bodies did not race for the door the way it had in every other cabin in the basin. It stayed. Marta moved among them like a small bent angel in a wool shawl. She tended Hetty, whose color had come back by the second night, and who woke on the morning of the fifth day, and asked in a voice clear as a bell whether she could pet the dog. She tended Linnea, whose fever broke at 3 o'clock on the morning of the fifth day. Ansel was sitting beside her bed. He had been sitting there for 6 hours. Marta laid her hand on the child's forehead and let it stay there for a long time. And then she said, very quiet, "There, there. The fire is out, Ansel. The fire is out." Ansel laid his head down on the edge of the bed. He did not weep this time. He was past weeping. He simply laid his head down, and Linnea, in her sleep, turned her small face toward him, and the breath that came out of her mouth was the warm, even breath of a child who would see another summer. It was late on the fifth day that Thorsten Crawford finally rose from the floor by the door. He had not slept. He had refused food until Hetty had eaten. He had sat with his back against the wall and watched the cabin around him for 30 hours, watched the lamp burn straight, watched the walls hold, watched 17 people sleep in a space he had once said would be a coffin for two, and his face in those 30 hours had changed. It had aged, but it had also softened. It had become somehow more open. He stood up, he crossed the room, he stopped in front of Ansel, who was sitting at the table with a tin cup of coffee between his hands. Thorsten took off his hat. He held it in both his frostbitten hands. "I came up here in August," he said. "I sat on my horse in front of your wall, and I called you a fool in front of your children. I told you that you were building a coffin. I rode away. And then I went down to the Cottonwood Hotel, and I said the same thing to every man who would listen." His voice was steady. It was very low. It was the voice of a man who had practiced these words in his head for 3 days and 3 nights and would now say them once. He stopped. He looked down at his own frostbitten hands. He turned them over once, slowly, as if he had never seen them before. "There is something else, Brattvik. Something I have carried for 6 years, and I will carry it the rest of my life, but I will not carry it without saying it to you tonight. In the spring of '86, when you came back from town with your new bride, you needed a cabin raised before the snow. You did not have men. You did not have time. I came up here with 3 of my hands and a wagon of green cottonwood, and we put up your walls in 2 weekends. We were proud of it. We rode home laughing about how fast we had done it. I was 44 years old. I thought I knew everything a man could know about building a house on the high plains." He paused. He drew a breath that hurt him. "I built the house that killed your wife, Brattvik. I built it with my own hands, and when you started building this wall, what I saw was not a foolish man. What I saw was a man telling me every morning with every stone he laid that the work I had done had killed Sarah Brattvik, and I could not stand to look at it. So I called you a fool. I told the valley you were a fool. I needed them to believe it, because if they did not believe it, then I would have to believe the other thing. And the other thing, Brattvik, the other thing was more than I could carry." He stopped. He could not go on. Ansel did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Very quiet. I built it with you, Thorsten. I was in a hurry. I did not open the notebook. The man who killed Sarah is sitting at this table, but he is not sitting in your chair. He is sitting in mine. We will not pass that weight back and forth between us tonight. Set it down. I have already set mine down. Set yours down." Thorsten Crawford put his face into his hands. He sat that way for a long time. When he raised his face, he was not a younger man, but he was somehow a less heavy one. "My son's wife is alive because of you," he said. "My granddaughter is alive because of you. My grandson," he stopped again. He looked at the small bundle in the basket beside the stove, where the baby, a boy, 4 months old, was sleeping with one tiny fist against his mouth. "My grandson Thorsten said is alive because of you, and the boy is alive, Brattvik, because you went into a storm to bring him out of a barn after I had already called you a fool. After I had told my own son not to send for help from you. After I had..." He could not finish that sentence either. But he did not need to. Ansel stood up. He extended his hand across the table. Thorsten Crawford took it. The 2 men shook hands. Neither of them spoke. Behind them, in the doorway to the back of the cabin, Rhett Tanner stood watching with his cap still in his hand and his mouth set hard and his eyes wet. He would come to Ansel an hour later and say his own small version of the same thing. So would Klaus Reinholdt's wife, who had laughed once on the steps of the church. Garrett Wexler, the blacksmith who had refused to make Ansel's tools that August came up the hill on the 10th day, walking because his forge had burned through the storm and he had no horse left to ride. He stood in the doorway with his big iron-stained hands at his sides. He did not come inside. He said only, "I will make whatever tools you need for the rest of my life, and I will not take payment for them." Then he turned and walked back down the hill in the snow, and he kept his word until the day he died. Prudence Mallory, who had said on the church steps that Ansel had lost his mind, did not come to the cabin. She was a proud woman, and her pride did not allow it. But that spring, when Linnea took a small cough again in April, Prudence Mallory walked 5 miles up the hill with a basket of preserves and a knit shawl for the child, and she set them on the porch, and she walked away without knocking. She did this every spring for the rest of her life. Ansel never spoke of it, and neither did she, and that, in its own quiet way, was her apology. So, eventually, would every adult in Cottonwood Hollow who had ever spoken a wrong word about Ansel Bratvick, there was no celebration of it. There was only the saying and the doing, and the storm outside beginning at last on the 7th of its days to fall away. Take a breath with me. We are coming to the last part of the story, but I want you to stay a moment longer in this room. 17 people alive in a house that should not have held them. A man who lost his wife to a poorly built cabin and who built with his own hands a thing strong enough to hold back the worst storm of a generation. A boy who rode through a blizzard alone and lived. A small girl whose fever broke in the dry, still air of a house that was finally what a house ought to be. Have you ever been on either side of an apology like Thorsten Crawford's? Have you ever had to say "I was wrong" out loud in front of people after years of being sure you were right? Or have you ever stood across the table from someone offering you that apology and had to decide what to do with it? Tell me. I would like to know. The storm ended on the 8th morning. It did not end the way storms in storybooks end. There was no clear sunrise, the sky stayed flat and gray and heavy for 2 more days, but the wind dropped, the snow stopped moving. And by the afternoon of that 8th day, men began to come up the road from town singly, on snowshoes, then in pairs, then in small parties to look for the dead. They found them. 23 souls had died in Sweetwater County between the 11th and the 18th of November, 1891. The bodies were found in cabins where the roofs had come down, in drifts where men had become disoriented, walking from house to barn. In one case, an entire family of 4 was found together in a sod dugout that had simply failed, the green roof beam snapping under the snow load, the cold finding them where they slept. The Little Frame Methodist Church at the south end of the basin had collapsed on the 3rd night of the storm. It had not killed anyone, because no one had been inside. But it had ended the ministry of Reverend Obadiah Pike. He was seen on the morning of the 9th day, loading 2 trunks into a buckboard outside the boarding house in town. He did not speak to anyone. He did not say goodbye. He drove east on the Rock Springs Road, and he did not return, and the boarding house keeper said later that the only thing he had said the whole time he was packing was, "I cannot face them now." He never did face them. He was not heard from again in Cottonwood Hollow. Cornelius Strand lost almost half his cattle. The herd he had brought down off the upper pastures had drifted into a wash on the 2nd day of the storm, and the snow had filled the wash, and the cattle had died standing up. He found them on the morning of the 9th day. He stood at the rim of the wash with the foreman of his outfit, and he did not speak for a long time, and then he turned around and got back into his polished black buggy and drove home. He did not call on Ansel Bratvick again. He did not offer to buy the spring. 3 years later, in the long, quiet summer of 1894, the same summer that Ansel married a woman from Pennsylvania named Astrid Quinn, Cornelius Strand drove his polished black buggy up the Bratvick Hill one last time. He did not get out. He sat in the seat and he looked at the stone wall, weathered now, gray lichen, beginning to spread along the lower courses. He sat there for perhaps a quarter of an hour, then he turned the buggy. He drove back down the hill. He never came up it again. What he was thinking in that quarter hour, he never told anyone, but the foreman of his outfit said afterward that the boss was a softer man after that summer and slower to call other men fools. Some men learn their lesson in words, some learn it in silence. Cornelius Strand learned his in silence. The first man who came to Ansel that spring asking to be taught was Klaus Reinhold. He came up the road in March when the snow was still deep in the gravel trench around the stone wall, but when the lower drifts had begun to retreat. He had a notebook of his own, a small black book he had bought at the store in town, and he asked in his careful, slow English whether Ansel would show him step by step how he had built the wall. Ansel showed him. He showed him through April and into May. He showed him where to set the lower vents. He showed him the angle of the drainage skirt. He showed him the lime mix that had worked through the freeze thaw of October and the one that had not. He showed him the depth of the gravel trench. He showed him page by page the careful, slanted handwriting in the leather notebook of Halvar Quinn. By the end of June, Klaus had begun his own wall around his own dugout. By August, there were 3. By the next winter, there were 14 stone-walled cabins in Sweetwater County, and the men of the basin had begun to use a word for them that no one had used before. They called them Brattvik walls. Ansel did not like the word. He never called them that himself. He called them, when he had to call them anything at all, Halvar's walls. The other man who came to him that spring was Thorsten Crawford. He came in late April. He did not come on horseback. He came on foot, in a clean shirt with his hat in his hand. He did not say much when he arrived. He asked whether he could see the cavity behind the north wall, and Ansel took him there, and they stood inside the narrow gap between the stone and the cottonwood logs for a long, quiet time. Thorsten ran his hand along the inner wood. He looked at the small, careful vents. He looked up at where the cavity opened beneath the roof beam. Then he turned to Ansel and he said, "Will you come down and look at my place? I want to build one. I am too old to build it alone. My son will help. But I want you to look at it first and tell me where to begin." Ansel went. He stood that afternoon on the foundation of Thorsten Crawford's collapsed cabin. He looked at the slope, he looked at the prevailing wind, he looked at the spring that came up out of the rocks behind the place, and he said, "There, 12 feet to the south, you will lose the morning sun on the kitchen window, but you will gain the lee of the ridge." Thorsten nodded. He did not argue. The cabin Thorsten Crawford built that summer with his son and with Klaus Reinhold and with 2 hired men from town stood for the next 63 years. His granddaughter Hetty, who had nearly died in the wool blanket on the rug beside Ansel's stove, would raise her own 4 children inside it. The wagon came up the road in the late summer of 1892. It was a small wagon, drawn by 1 tired bay horse. Driving it was a young woman, perhaps 28 years old, in a black bonnet and a black traveling dress. In the seat beside her was a girl of about 10, and behind her in the wagon bed were 2 trunks and a sleeping boy of 5 wrapped in a quilt. She stopped at the foot of the hill. She looked up at the cabin with the dark stone wall around it. Then she drove on slowly the last 100 yards, and she reined her horse in beside the porch, and she sat in the wagon seat for a long moment without coming down. Ansel had stepped out onto the porch. He had been slitting kindling. He held the axe loose in his hand, and he looked at the woman in the black bonnet, and he saw, in the slope of her shoulders and in the line of her jaw, a face he had not seen in 15 years. "You are a Quinn," he said. The woman's eyes filled. "I am Astrid Quinn," she said. "Halvar Quinn was my grandfather. My father Halvar's only son went west to the Oregon country in 84, and we never heard from him again. My mother died of the consumption when I was 10. My grandfather raised me. He raised me on stories of a quiet boy in the silver camps who had finally understood the candle." She lifted out of the wagon a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. It was another notebook. It was thicker than the one Ansel kept on his shelf. Its leather was darker. Its pages, when he opened them later that night by the stove, with Astrid sitting across from him and her 2 children asleep beside Linnea on the trundle bed, contained every drawing and every measurement and every careful note that Halvar Quinn had not yet been able to put into the first notebook before he died. It was the complete blueprint. It was the rest of the lesson. Halvar had been writing it down to the very last week of his life. He had left it on the table beside his bed, and his nephew Eamon, who had not understood what it was, had sent it on to Astrid in Philadelphia, and Astrid, newly widowed herself, with 2 small children and a husband dead of consumption, had read every page of it and had understood slowly what her grandfather had been trying to do. She had understood also the name in the back of the notebook. Ansel Brattvik, Wyoming territory, last known. She had sold her husband's small bookshop in Philadelphia. She had bought a wagon. She had come west. She did not know when she came what she was going to find. She did not know whether Ansel was still alive. She did not know whether he had ever built anything. She had only known that her grandfather had written, on the inside cover of the second notebook, in his slanted, careful hand, "If I am not finished, find the boy." She had found the boy. The boy was 35 years old now, and he had finished the work. Astrid Quinn stayed. She did not mean to when she came. She had meant only to deliver the notebook and to see with her own eyes the cabin her grandfather had helped build from 2,000 miles and 15 years away. But the small house was warm. The 2 children of the man inside it were good with her own 2 children. Marta Olson, who came every Friday with the mail, took to Astrid the way she might have taken to a daughter. Linnea, who was 6 years old by the next summer and who had not had a winter cough since the fever broke, climbed into Astrid's lap on the 3rd evening and fell asleep there. Ansel did not speak to Astrid of marriage that year, or the next. They were both still in mourning. They had both lost the person they had thought they would grow old beside. There was no hurry. But in the spring of 1894, in the small new Methodist church that the people of Cottonwood Hollow had built to replace the one that had collapsed, Ansel Brattvik and Astrid Quinn stood in front of a circuit preacher and were married. Wren was 12. Linnea was 8. Astrid's daughter, Hannah, was 11, and her son, Tobias, named for Helver's older brother, was 7. Old Ezra Voss gave the bride away because Astrid had no living father, and because she had asked him the week before, and the old man had wept into his beard and said it would be the honor of his last years. Marta Olson baked the cake. Thorsten Crawford brought a young calf as a wedding gift and stood in the back of the church with his hat in his hands the whole time. And when Ansel and Astrid walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Thorsten was the first man to take Ansel's hand. He did not say anything when he took it. He did not need to. The years went on. In 1899, Ozark, who had been Sarah's dog first, who had walked out of his mourning to lay down beside Ansel's boots, who had barked the night Wren disappeared into the storm and whined the morning, Thorsten came staggering up the road with a small girl in his arms. Ozark grew thin in the autumn and stopped eating in the first week of December and went to sleep on a Tuesday afternoon in the patch of sun that fell through the south window onto the rag rug. He was 19 years old. That is very old for a hound. Wren, who was 17 by then, dug the grave himself. He dug it in the corner of the yard beneath the cottonwood tree that Sarah had planted the first spring of her marriage. He set a flat piece of black basalt at the head of it. He did not carve a name into the stone. He did not need to. Everyone in the family knew whose grave it was, and everyone in the family for the rest of their lives would pause when they walked past it. In 1903, Wren left Cottonwood Hollow. He went to the new agricultural college at Laramie. He studied engineering. He came home in the summers, and he worked on stone walls and barn roofs with his father, and he wrote down everything they did in a small black notebook of his own. In 1910, he married a schoolteacher from Cheyenne named Eleanor Sage. In 1912, their first son was born. They named him Halvar. One last pause with me before we close this story. I am going to ask you to do something. I am going to ask you to think, just for a moment, about the people in your own life who have built something quiet, something that no one applauded, something that no one understood at the time, something that they did because the doing of it was the right thing. A grandmother who insisted on the old recipe, a father who kept the old garden, a mother who held a family together through a winter that no one outside the family even knew was happening. We do not always recognize in the moment what those people were doing. Sometimes we are even ashamed of them. Sometimes we laugh the way Cottonwood Hollow laughed, and then much later when we are cold and the world is hard, we open the door of the thing they built and we step inside and we understand. If there is someone like that in your life, someone living or someone you have lost, I want you to tell me about them in the comments. Tonight, say their name. Let it be said out loud one more time. Ansel Brattvik lived to be 82 years old. He was carried home to rest in the spring of 1939 on a quiet Sunday morning. In the same cabin he had built the wall around in the summer of his 35th year. He went peacefully in the bed where Sarah had once been. He had asked for it that way. Astrid sat beside him through the night. Wren came down from his place in Laramie. Linnea came up from Salt Lake, where she had become a midwife herself, trained under Marta in her last years, and licensed by the state of Utah in 1928. They were all with him at the end. He did not speak much in the last hour, but just before his eyes closed for the last time, he turned his face toward the north wall of the cabin, the wall he had built with his own hands against the laughter of a valley, and he smiled. It was a small smile. It was the smile of a man who had finished his work. They laid him to rest beside Sarah in the cottonwood grove behind the cabin, and they set a flat black piece of basalt at the head of his place there, and they did not carve much on it, only his name. Only the years. Astrid lived another 11 years. Marta Olson had gone before them in 1926 at the age of 95. She had still been carrying the mail 2 days before her last day. Old Ezra Voss had gone in 1906 in his half dugout on the East Rim, in his sleep, with his one-eyed mule standing in the doorway and refusing to leave the place until Ansel and Klaus had come and carried the old man out gently to be buried beside his wife. Thorsten Crawford had gone in 1921, 80 years old, in the stone-walled cabin that Ansel had helped him build, surrounded by his son and his daughter-in-law and 4 of his grandchildren, including Hetty. Hetty was 28 years old the day her grandfather went home. She kept his hat. She kept it, in fact, all her life, well into her 90s, in a small frame house in Casper, Wyoming, where she would sometimes take it down off the shelf and hold it on her lap and tell the great-grandchildren about a storm she had lived through when she was 6 years old, and a man named Bratvik who had built a wall, and a quiet boy named Wren who had grown up to be an engineer, and an old dog named Ozark who had whined at the door on the morning her grandfather brought her up the road in his arms. The cabin still stands. It stands on a low ridge in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, about 4 miles from a paved road that did not exist when Ansel built it. The land passed to Wren, and from Wren to his son Halvar, and from Halvar to a granddaughter who teaches school in Rock Springs and who comes up to the place on the weekends in summer. The stone wall has weathered. Gray lichens have spread across the lower courses. Some of the upper mortar has crumbled and been repaired, more than once, by hands that learned from hands that learned from Ansel's hands. The north face is scarred from a century and a half of drifting ice and blowing gravel, but the wall stands, the cavity behind it stands. The lower vents are still open, and the upper vents beneath the roof beam are still open, and the gravel drainage trench still carries the spring melt away from the foundation, exactly as Halvar Quinn drew it on the inside of his second notebook in the year of his own dying. Researchers from a state university came out once, in the late 1970s, and measured the temperature inside the cabin on a January night when it was 28 degrees below zero outside. The temperature inside, with only a small wood stove burning, was 58 degrees above. They wrote about it in a paper that very few people read. But the principle they described in that paper, a cavity wall with controlled ventilation, allowing the dead air between 2 layers of mass to act as insulation while preventing moisture from accumulating against the inner wall, is the same principle that is now used under different names and with different materials in cold climate buildings all over the world. It is used in passive houses in the north of Europe. It is used in research stations in Antarctica. It is used in the new high-efficiency homes that builders are putting up this year in the colder parts of the United States. None of those builders know the name Halvar Quinn. Almost none of them know the name Ansel Bratvik. But the principle is the same, and the principle is older than either of those men. It is older than Pennsylvania. It is older than Norway. It is as old, perhaps, as the first human being who lay down inside a cave on a winter night and noticed that the air did not move there and that the warmth of his own small fire stayed beside him until morning. We forget these things sometimes in the centuries between, and then a quiet man somewhere against the laughter of a valley remembers. There is a saying that Ren Bratvik used to tell his own grandchildren in the long winter evenings in the cabin his father had built. He had heard it, he said, from his father, who had heard it from Halvar Quinn, who had heard it from his own father in a fishing village in Norway in the 1820s. Heat survives, the saying went, where air dies. It is a saying about walls. It is also, if you sit with it long enough, a saying about a great many other things. It is a saying about marriages that lasted because the people inside them learned finally to be still with each other. It is a saying about griefs that did not destroy the ones who carried them, because the ones who carried them learned to stop running from the cold and to let the warmth of small things, a child's hand, a dog's head on a boot, the smell of bread, the steady flame of a lamp that does not tremble, gather and stay. It is a saying about whole communities, even that survive their hard winters, because somebody somewhere in them was quiet enough and stubborn enough to build a thing the rest of them laughed at. The cabin still stands. The wall still holds. And somewhere tonight, in some house you cannot see, in some town you have never heard of, there is a person doing a quiet, patient thing that no one around them understands. Maybe that person is you. If it is, I want you to know something. The storm does not always come when we want it to. The vindication does not always come in our own lifetime. Halvar Quinn went home alone in an unfinished cellar, and he never knew what his student would build 2,000 miles away with the notebook he had left behind. But the work was not wasted. The work is never wasted. The stillness you are building, in whatever form you are building it, will hold something one day. A child, a grandchild, a neighbor you have not yet met, a stranger pulled out of a barn at the end of a long, bad road. It will hold them, and in the holding, your name, even if no one ever speaks it again, will become a part of the long, quiet line of names that have kept the human family alive through every winter that the world has thrown at us. Build it anyway. Build it slow, build it well, and do not stop, because they are laughing. They always laugh until the storm comes. If this story moved you, sit with it a moment before you go. Take a breath. Think of someone who built a quiet stillness for you when you were small or sick or alone. Say their name in the comments if you want to. I will read every one of them. Good night from me to you, wherever you are watching from. May your house be still. May your lamp burn straight. And may the wall you have built, in whatever form you have built it, hold what you love through every winter that is yet to come.